Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is time to encapsulate everything that has happened in 2024 in the LoL esports scene because it is the 2024 World Championship Finals. It is the final series of the year, the final games of the year. Everything we've covered on this channel, the entirety of 2024 has led up to this moment between these two teams. I'm so excited to get into it. I know you guys are as well. Of course, you can check out any of my Worlds coverage that you are interested in up in the iCard. We've covered every single game at this tournament, as we have covered every single game from both of these teams throughout the entire year, domestically, internationally. All of it has been on the channel. I don't usually do this at the beginning of these videos, but I just want to give a big thank you to everybody who's, stuck around for the entirety of the year, whether you've joined me for Worlds, whether you've been watching my coverage of specific regions or things like that. It really does mean a lot that you guys have supported the channel so much over the course of this year and over the course of this tournament. We've covered every single game from the LCS, the LEC, the LCK, and the LPL all year long, every single one, and so for it all to culminate here, I'm just so excited, but I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. There is so much to get into. Of course, let me know what you thought was going to happen down in the comment section below, whether or not you expected the team that won to win, or whether or not you were maybe surprised by the outcome. I think that there is definitely an argument for both. Usually I do these reactions live, but I was at a watch party for the finals, so this is coming out a couple hours late. I don't think you guys are going to mind too much. It's not like we've got a big time crunch in terms of the games coming up, but a lot to talk about in terms of the games that we saw here. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new to the channel, what we are going to do is go game by game here in the finals, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we will cover, and of course, I will be giving a finals MVP at the end of the video, a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. As you guys know, nothing to cover, nothing to preview. This is it, the final series, the final games of the 2024 season. Everything has built up to this, so let's get right into the preview. Let's talk about these two teams. We've talked about them so much over the course of this tournament, but there are some really neat intricacies to talk about in terms of this matchup in particular. As you guys know, it is a matchup, as you can see on your screen, between the number 1 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming and the number 4 seed from the LCK in T1. Now, that sounds like a mismatch on paper, but of course, you look at these two organizations and there's no way that you see this as a mismatch. These are definitely the two teams that have performed the best at this tournament so far. They proved that in the semifinals, both of them very much outclassing their opponents. Bilibili obliterating Weibo, very much pushing their way into the finals with as much momentum as you could possibly get. This team struggled a bit in the Swiss stage, but really a lot of their struggles, quote unquote, in the Swiss stage were them not really understanding what the meta was and where the meta was at in terms of where they needed to be. The moment they started getting on the same page as a lot of the other teams, playing a lot of the things that are strong and not giving over free strong picks, that's when they started to really explode. And honestly, from that point onwards, they've been exceptional. I still would argue that the best series so far at this tournament has been their quarterfinals matchup against Hanwha Life. That 4-game series was exceptional, and that game 4 was so perfectly executed. Bilibili has earned their place here. I think one of the things that I really want to expand on as we preview this a bit, one of the most interesting storylines for me is that I think the two best individual players at the tournament so far are in this series, one on each side. I think Knight has been arguably the best player at Worlds so far. I certainly think it's absolutely in the conversation. He has been utterly exceptional. I know there are a lot of people that still try to make the argument that Knight is just a glorified domestic killer. At this point, I think it is clear, at least in my eyes, he is the best Chinese League of Legends player of all time, and I think if he can really cement that in the World Finals, that's going to be the biggest story that we could possibly take away from this. The Korean mid dynasty has carried through since 2013. Knight has the chance and will have the opportunity to become the first player to upset that since 2012. And so a lot on the line for Knight, who has really stepped up so far, but it's not just him. Elk and On have been exceptional. Elk has been unbelievably good, especially in the best of 5 series so far in both the quarterfinals and the semifinals. He has really been a game changer for Bilibili Gaming. Obviously, Elk is somebody that's been a bit of a channel darling in the past, and so I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, he's unbelievable. You should already know that. You should watch Elk, and if you've gotten to this point, you probably know that, in my opinion, he's the best AD carry in the world. I think he has been over the course of this year. I think he has proved that at the World Championships, and I think he pairs off of On well. Now, On has not been nearly as consistent, but the bot lane generally is still going to be a massive positive. They are one of the best lane swap bot lanes in the world, especially because Elk is so adept at being able to generate early leads. it just creates these situations where Bilibili are constantly in positive spots, and they don't really have a lot of ways to be taken advantage of. Elk is super consistent at carrying in the late game, and he's probably the most aggressive ADC in the world early anyways. You've got Shun in the jungle. He gets reinserted back into the lineup here midway through the World Championships after being benched in the Summer Split 4-way, the new acquisition from RNG. He gets put back in because they needed spice. They needed somebody that was going to come in and play super aggressive, and quite frankly, he has been unbelievable. I was very not frustrated, but confused by the decision to remove him from the starting lineup in the first place, because it just felt like he was growing and getting better game over game, and it felt like they disrupted a lot of that process by benching him. I understand that they're looking for results now, but I've said it for a while. If this team wants to win Worlds, I think Shun has to be the starting jungler. He just gives you more of an upside, and I think he has shown that throughout this tournament. Every single game he has played, he has made a massive impact, both for good and for bad. And then Bin, I mean, the focal player for Bilibili Gaming on the top side. This is the only player on this team who has been to a World Finals before, and that kind of experience is entirely invaluable. People are going to think back to 2020, and they're going to think back to his pentakill in that World Finals and how Suning was just so overmatched and so overwhelmed in terms of the talent against Damwon that there was really no chance that they were ever going to win it. But Bin tried his absolute best to be able to get them across that finish line. He's going to have a second opportunity against an LCK team here now. This is a massive Bilibili team. They have dominated the LPL over the course of the entire year. If there was ever a Chinese team to be able to take down T1 in the finals, it is going to be this one. But it is T1 in the finals. This is an unconquerable beast. Obviously, they've lost before. They're not perfect. They lost in 2017. They lost in 2022, but those are the minority appearances. The most that we have seen from T1 is them hoisting that trophy over and over and over again. And honestly, regardless of how they got to this tournament, there is no reason to believe that they can't do that again here. When you are talking about what we have seen at this tournament, they just dismantled and beat what people consider to be the best team in the world in Gen G. They did so in the quarterfinals against a team that has had their number throughout the entire year in top esports, who had looked excellent. They completely shut their own brains off for that. It has been a dominant road here for T1, re-cementing the expectation that they should be the standard bearers for League of Legends, and it's through everyone. The first player you have to talk about, if Knight has arguably been the best player at this tournament, the other player that is arguing for that is Owner, the jungler for T1, who has been exceptionally good here at Worlds so far. He has created so much for T1 in every single game, and I think the most interesting thing is he doesn't have to have a lot of these carry picks in order to do it. I would argue that this is his best tournament, his best like 1 month stretch ever of his entire career. That is the argument I will make. He has never played the way that he is playing right now, and boy do they need it, because there has been some inconsistencies. I think Zeus and Faker, while they've been good at this tournament, they've not exactly been game breakers. Zeus has had moments where he's just completely obliterated people when he wins. He wins incredibly hard, but there are times where he can sometimes fade into the background, and Faker has notoriously not exactly been dominant over the course of 2024. I think, especially over the past 3 to 4 months, I've argued that it's the worst stretch of his entire career. I think we've seen some really bad mental decisions where he's forcing plays and making mistakes that he wouldn't normally make. Those can't happen here in the finals, but it's Faker in the finals. You have to imagine that's not going to happen, especially because it feels like he's already weeded out a lot of those mistakes in the best of fives leading into this. But Guma and Keria, that's really where my eyes are going to be at for T1. Guma Yushi is the reason that T1 is at this tournament, period. End of story. When you watch the regional qualifiers, hell, when you watch the regular season for T1, the reason this team didn't go 5 wins in the regular season and miss playoffs is because Guma was playing so well for them in a stretch where everybody felt like they were just cold as ice. He was incredibly consistent for them all year long, and he has been incredibly consistent for them at this tournament. He is going to need to step up in a meta that really favors AD carries, and Keria, I mean, what can I say? The heart and soul of this T1 team, I think that is an entirely fair thing to say. When he is playing well, like he has been at this tournament, he is unstoppable, and he is clearly the best support in the world. That has never been in question. I got criticism for putting him in my top 20 players at Worlds list because people are talking about how it's just not been there so far in 2024, but if it's there, which it has been, there's nobody in the world that's going to be able to stop him both in and out of lane. He is a meta breaker, and he is a meta definer, and we'll have to see if that can come through here on the World Finals stage. If T1 wins this, they become the single greatest group of 5 players in the history of LoL esports, and that is not disputable. If Bilibili wins this, they take down the T1 dynasty. Knight becomes the first ever Chinese mid laner to hoist the Summoner's Trophy, and Bin finally gets his revenge for 2020, alongside so many young Chinese players like Shun and Elk and On that have come through the system, been told that they're not good enough, and gotten here anyways. This is the dream finals for so many, and if you're asking who I'm favoring in something like this, I can't tell you that. This is as close as it gets. BLG has been better for basically all of this year, but it's T1 in the finals, and when you compare the form that both of them are in, it really is entirely up to your personal, debate there. So I'm not going to pick a favorite. I'm just going to go ahead and get into the games. I know the intro is long, but it's the final series of the year. You gotta hype this up. I know you guys are already excited, so let's get into it. If we are going to go game by game, that means we got to start with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take the 1-0 lead in this series. They're going to pick up that game 1 win. This is a ginormous win for them, not only because picking up game 1 is so important in a best of 5, as we all already kind of know, but because of the way that they did it. This was not a close game. Huge shout out to the BLG coaching staff. Obviously, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding some events with some Gen G coaches over the course of this week that has been taken entirely out of context and entirely out of proportion. If you truly believe that Bilibili is not going to be looking at the same things that a Gen G coach is streaming at, you are absurd. Bilibili has clearly done their homework, because whatever level 1s they have spotted from T1 that have been super consistent, they knew exactly how to punish it. Knight with a perfect flank early at level 1, they're able to get the first blood onto Gumayushi, or onto Elk against Gumayushi, and then all of a sudden the game just spirals basically entirely out of control from that point onwards. This comp is very dangerous to play into when you already have a lead, and quite frankly, T1 didn't feel particularly comfortable on their version of this comp. I'll explain why a little more later. There are 2 players, obviously, that I don't think are very good at the champions that they were piloting, not all that great for the World Finals, but another who is super comfortable that just didn't have a good game, and again, it's very important to kind of talk about that, but player of the game is very difficult for BLG because I think there are 2 exceptionally good options here. Whether you want to give it to Knight or Elk, I think is really up to you. Both, I think, were really good in different ways. Elk made the highlight play for me, and that's why he gets a little bit of the edge here. I think Knight was just as consistent, if not even a little bit more consistent in terms of making positive plays over the course of the game. But that arrow coming in from Elk, I mean, that's going to be played in highlight reels forever, regardless of what ends up happening in this series. Being able to land that arrow onto Faker after a really beautiful bot lane play here, it's just gorgeous. And Elk was able to masterfully play out the entirety of this game. His positioning is excellent. Ashe in general is incredibly strong. I think the draft here from BLG is really smart. They're more than happy to trade over the Yone. They know that Faker's not particularly good at that champion, or comfortable at the very least at that champion, and we'll talk about that a bit more later, but they themselves get the Skarner and the Ashe, 2 picks that have been so high prio throughout this best of 5 stage, and they really make them feel punished for that. This was a huge punish in draft, and Elk, I think, was kind of the one spearheading that. Ashe is just so dangerous to play into, especially when you give her first blood at 1 minute into the game. All of a sudden now she can just completely oppress the Caitlyn, and there's really no way for Guma to be able to stay in the game. I think Elk was everything he should have been in this. But again, if you wanted to give it to Knight on the Sylas, this is about as dream of a Sylas game as you could ask for. I would argue that Knight is the best Sylas in the world. I think that there is definitely some debate in terms of that kind of narrative, but he is certainly in the conversation, and this was just another explanation as to why. A beautiful laning phase coming in from him basically after the first 4 minutes of the game. He was able to really dominate that 1v1 and really be able to take a gigantic lead, and from that point onwards, his macro game was about as perfect as it gets. Again, the team fighting was really nice. The ability to steal things like Yone ultimate was actually huge. The Caitlyn ultimate obviously was huge, and the Gnar ultimate obviously coming into clutch a lot of situations as well. Knight and Elk, what do you want me to say? They've been carrying this entire tournament, not maybe entirely by themselves, but they've been stars this entire tournament for BLG, and they carried that through here to game 1. I also want to give a lot of credit to the Skarner here, Shun. He was really good in terms of pathing and creating opportunities for his team to play aggressive, and I think that's all you really need to see out of a Skarner. I think a lot of people are expecting that champion to kind of carry on his own because of the priority that's been put on him throughout a lot of these drafts in terms of bans and in terms of early picks. That's just not Skarner's game, but if you ask him to be able to set up and create for Ashe, yeah, that's Skarner's game. On was really good on the Rel. Ben at times looked a little less comfortable on the Rumble, but, we'll excuse that because everything else went so well, and this is about as dreamy extreme of a start as it gets for BLG in the World Finals. But for T1 on the other side, this is just not a comp that I think they're going to particularly love that they drafted for themselves, quite frankly, in game number 1. They have to take the bait on the Yone. Clearly, they said to themselves, well, if it's up, we can't just give it to them on red side. We can't really play against it, so we have to take it, okay? Well, what are we pairing it with? Well, we're pairing it with Sejuani. That's obvious. We're going to pick the Gnar in the top lane to try to get Zeus something that he can be relatively safe on that doesn't really cause too much panic, and we're going to try to get a winning 2v2 down in the bot lane. But here's the problem. Not only is Faker not winning in the mid lane, and not only is he really not all that useful throughout this entire game on what is supposedly the most broken champion to be able to make it through on the patch, but Keria is also playing something in Braum that he is like notoriously not very good at, and even with Gumayushi on Caitlyn, something he's played a ton of and something that's been very comfortable for him. You know, I mentioned this actually in the video against Gen G, where Caitlyn's actually been their preferred answer into Ashe. This is not a game where Guma can step up, and quite frankly, he wasn't good. He's going to get dead of the game for me. His positioning really bad, wasn't really setting himself into good positions. Obviously, getting caught at level 1's not ideal, but go look at every single one of these fights. The most useful thing Gumayushi did this entire game was give his ultimate to Knight, and that's really not a good place to be in. This Caitlyn was just never in a spot to be able to actually deal any damage. Now, again, if you want to give this dud of the game to Faker or Keria, I think they are also viable options because both of them were just straight up not good here in game number 1. And if that's going to carry over, like, obviously that's an unwinnable situation for T1. They're not going to be able to play if Yone and Braum and champions like that, or Faker and Keria as players are not going to be able to be successful. But Guma in particular has kind of been the rock, the heart of this team in terms of being able to stabilize everything else regardless of how the rest of T1 is playing. That has not been the case so far in game number 1. That was a concerning performance. Owner really never got off the ground. I'm not going to blame him. I know his scoreline looks bad, but it's not entirely his fault. Zeus, I think, played a little worse than his scoreline would indicate. A couple of big plays coming in from the Gnar, like really flashy ones. The really good ones were really good, but some of the weaker plays were also still there as well, where he just didn't feel quite as comfortable in the Gnar. Again, it just didn't feel like a T1 style draft. I think Bilibili kind of pulled them apart on the red side, and that's really not good for T1. You're back on the blue side, presumably here in game number 2, and you do have to be able to make that count. Winning on blue side is essential, and obviously going down 0-2 to a team like Bilibili is a death sentence. So gigantic game 2. Is T1 going to be able to equalize, or is BLG going to get that dominant 2-0 series start? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series here at 1 apiece, and of course they needed this. You don't want to go down 0-2 to a team like Bilibili Gaming. I don't care if you're T1 in World Finals. Winning 3 games in a row is basically impossible at this level. To give yourself a chance in this series, you had to win game 2, and you know what? Why don't you Uno reverse card? Just basically do exactly what BLG did to you in game number 1. Just do it back to them here in game number 2 to even it all up. Of course, kind of different comps, definitely different ideologies between the two teams in terms of how they wanted to play out a lot of this game, but at the end of the day, you got a BLG stomp in game 1, you got a T1 stomp here in game 2. You're trading really good performances from these teams. Both of them have very much come to play. This makes things a lot more interesting when you're talking about the drafts between these two teams. I think BLG have a very clear idea of what they want to do, but I think they're lacking in a couple of key areas. I really don't like the Xin Zhao. I think it rounds out this comp really poorly, and I don't think it gives them as many options as maybe they would like, but it's not like I like T1's comp on the other side either. I still think Nocturne is mega boosted at this tournament. I think the biggest thing that he offers, and we'll talk about this was actually very valuable in this game, is just being able to shut off vision and being able to shut off the lights against the enemy team. I don't think the damage coming out from Nocturne is incredibly valuable. I do think, obviously, Owner ended up getting going in this game because things were really rolling for T1, but a lot of that was enabled by the rest of the team. But again, I'm not a huge fan of Nocturne on B5. I'm really not a fan of Ornn here on B4. I think it's very passive. I think it's very safe. All of these things to say that that's not really how it played out. I think this comp generally in the hands of a lesser team would really struggle to find ways to execute in the mid game and really find ways to not take advantage of Nocturne's unique strengths and Silas's unique strengths, but, you know, T1 is T1, so of course they were able to find ways to be able to make it work, and BLG just weren't able to capitalize, even after another really good level 1. Again, major props to whatever analyst on BLG was able to spot out T1's patterns, because clearly they have done a very deep dive into where T1 likes to path in specific scenarios, and they're able to capitalize on that, because getting this kind of lead and free kill in game 1 and game 2, you know, 2 games in a row here in World Finals, it's just exceptional exceptional prep from BLG. It doesn't really matter because T1 ends up winning out basically from that point onwards, but still want to give them credit in that regard. Player of the game, though, very, very easy for me. It's got to go to Keria. I don't even think this is up for debate. This is a gorgeous Renata game. If you want to criticize the Braum in game 1, you certainly cannot criticize the Renata here in game number 2. Renata is such a perfect champ for how Keria likes to operate and play in the game because he likes to be super aggressive early. Even in lane swaps, he really wants to try to get the most out of the situation that he has been placed in, you know, try to abuse Bin as much as possible in a lot of these circumstances, and obviously he's able to do that. But when you're talking about being able to take over in the 5v5s, in the team fights, that's where Keria really shines on things like Renata, and that's what separates him from a lot of other players that play this champ. You're not really seeing a lot of other players dominate on Renata in the way that Keria is able to do so consistently, and it's because he is so much better than them in this phase of the game, the back half of the game. When Keria is on, not when Keria is on, but when Keria is playing well. I shouldn't say that with on being the support on the other side, but when Keria is, you know, playing well, he's the best support in the world, and he continues to prove that. This was an immensely important bounce back from game number 1. And you could say the same thing about Guma Yushi. I thought Guma was the other player that I was kind of considering for player of the game here. Not really, because Keria was the very obvious choice for me, but Guma was phenomenal on the Kalista. Even being set behind early on, he did a really good job to be able to collect himself and still be useful. I know Kalista's talked about as if she's this exclusively lane-dominant champion that really doesn't do all that much in the mid to late game, but it's the mid-game part of that that really is important to stress, because she isn't very good in the mid-game, but in the late game, when she really is ramping, when she gets those 3 items, she's a huge problem. She's very difficult to deal with. Almost a similar curve to something like Caitlyn in that regard, where, you know, just because her early late game isn't exactly quite as dominant as some of these other hyper carries, she's often considered to not scale particularly well. But you do get to a point in the game where Kalista is incredibly dangerous, and Guma, if he's positioning himself well, which of course he was in this game, there's really not a lot of good ways to shut it down on BLG's comp. You have a lot of ways to shut down Sylas, not a ton to shut down the Kalista, but it's not like Faker was shut down anyways. This guy absolutely took over this game, was able to completely abuse, you know, Elk and On and Shun and Knight throughout the entirety of this. This is the kind of performance that Faker needed to show. It's not quite as dominant, in my opinion, as Knight's from game number 1, but it doesn't need it to be. His teammates were stars this game, and all he did was facilitate. The one thing I will say about Faker, this dude's out of his mind in some of these engages. A lot of that killer instinct that I'm not going to say really bit him in the butt a lot in the summer split, but certainly a lot of the plays that were negative came from this idea that he needed to force a lot of plays. We're definitely still seeing that version of Faker here on the world stage. He's getting away with it, though, because his mechanics are just so good, and it's really, really clear to see. Big credit to Owner. Again, the Nocturne ends up getting super fed here. I don't know how much of that is the champion, how much of that is the setup, but Owner was really good, and he has been great at this tournament. And Zeus, the flanking aggressive Ornn, it shouldn't be allowed. Completely illegal, but this was a phenomenal game from Zeus. Just a great top-to-bottom game for T1, even after some early struggles in the beginning levels. But for BLG, this just, again, almost exactly what I said about T1. It feels kind of anti what they like to do. Not only are you taking your best player, the one you specifically acquired to be able to kind of get yourself over the hump, and putting him on Galio in a comp where you don't have this, hyper carry. You don't have Kindred, you don't have Graves, you don't have this, unkillable jungle, supposed to 1v5 in the late game kind of, champion on this team. You've got Xin Zhao, who's supposed to win early. You've got something like Rumble, which I guess could theoretically function in that regard, but really shouldn't be asked to do that in a lot of situations, especially because the lane swap is going to be prevalent here. And amidst all that, you're taking your best player off of anything that can really carry in the late game. I'm really just not a fan of this draft, and I'm really just not a fan of this idea. That being said, there were a lot of things that needed to be done better by both teams, or by Bilibili, not by both teams. T1 was basically perfect after level 1, but Shun was awful in this game. Get him off of Xin Zhao. I hate this pick. I honestly think this is one of the weakest picks that we are consistently seeing at Worlds. I really have not seen the benefit. Xin Zhao is really good at skirmishing in the early game. I think you could even make an argument that he is the best skirmishing early game jungler in the meta right now, but the problem is just that you need to be aggressive, and teams are so adept at being able to take away a lot of that aggressiveness and not really giving over free advantages. That's what T1 did here. They didn't give the Xin Zhao the ability to kind of play through his strengths. They kind of said, okay, well, you're going to want to try to fight at level 4 and level 5. We're just not going to fight you. We're eventually going to be able to win in the mid game, and then there's really nothing you can do to be able to get back because the Xin Zhao doesn't do anything in the late late game. And so I just really don't like the pick. I think Shun was punished really hard for it. Again, not to say he was the only player who played poorly. I think Elk actually had a much worse game here in game 2 than he did in game 1. Ashe is still broken. She still is incredibly strong, especially into something like Kalista. Like, this is not a bad matchup for Ashe at all. Being able to slow Kalista is a major problem. And while you're maybe not going to be nearly as dominant in the early game after the free kill that you got in game number 1, you're still in a position where you should be able to start to snowball this game, and it felt like Elk was constantly putting himself in bad positions and eventually just kind of getting outplayed by the rest of T1 Knight. I mean, 0-5-1 is pretty indicative, I would say, of the gameplay. I don't think he was quite as bad as the scoreline would entail. I think players like Shun and Elk were definitely worse in this game, but Knight certainly wasn't effective. Take him off of Galio. He's not been good at Galio. They've been trying to force this over the course of this tournament. I think it's playable, but maybe in a different comp. I really don't like this overall, and again, BLG doing what T1 did in game 1 and moving away from the things that got them to the dance in the first place. You need to be able to play through your star, or alternatively, make your star a centralizing force in terms of how you are game planning. That's just not what this is for BLG, and they were punished really heavy for it. Again, red side, this is the kind of lead that T1 should be able to get in draft. On blue side, it's just kind of natural, but it's really frustrating to see it. So now we're tied up at 1 apiece. Both teams have shown that they can dominate the other in good scenarios, but which one is going to be able to take that ever important lead in game number 3? I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. I believe game 3 to be the most important game in the series, not because it's unwinnable if you lose it, if you're tied up, but because it is so much easier to win one of the final 2 games than to have to win both of the final 2 games. To get that pressure lifted off of your shoulders at least a little bit going into game 4 can really allow for some mental reprieve. This is a big game for both of these teams. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and you wanted comfort. You wanted them to get on something that they have played a lot before. Well, you know, I was criticizing the Galio. I said, maybe we should bring it with something like, I don't know, Kindred. Well, here you are. Shun, the Kindred player, ends up pulling it out. It's not quite Nidalee in terms of what I would consider his pocket picks to be, but it is pretty damn close. It is certainly up there, and boy, did he make T1 pay. Now, that's not to say T1 don't have a good draft here. I honestly think this is arguably the best draft of the series for both of these teams, because I think it is so much more cohesive for both of them. Both of them have very clear win conditions and very clear situations that they want to play for, and again, comfort on both sides. You have things like Owner on Vi, you have things like Gumi Yushi on the Xayah, you have Carry on the Renato, we already talked about, but for Bilibili on the other side, Shun on the Kindred, you have Elk on the Kalista, you have on the Blitzcrank, something that I've said for forever is his best champion. I continue to believe is the champion that I kind of think of first when I think of On. I know everybody talks about the Rakan. I talk about the Blitzcrank. That's really what it's been for me over the course of his entire career. It's insane to see that both teams really just said, screw it, we are going to play the things we like, and it really does end up working out for BLG. Another game that doesn't end up being particularly close, but has opportunities to be close. The problem is BLG just takes such good advantage of the small situations that they are given throughout this game, and honestly, player of the game kind of has to go to Shun. I don't care what the scoreline says, whether or not you want to look at the 7 kills on Bin, the 7 kills on Elk, hell, even the flashy plays that On or Knight made throughout this game. I mean, Shun abused T1 in this game. The pathing was gorgeous. He was constantly in positions where he could just get advantages. He was always in a spot where he could gain his mark, regardless of whether or not he should have been or should have been allowed to enter those situations. His team was so willing to give up a lot of their priority in order to make sure the Kindred was in a good spot that he ended up just getting so monstrously fed that there was no way to play out the game from there. And then you look forward like 5 more minutes, and now all of a sudden he's up 40 CS, and there's really nothing Owner can do to be able to salvage the game. He hit 4 marks so early in this and just completely obliterated the game. I mean, Shun, this is a masterclass in how to play Kindred, and truly, I cannot stress enough, like the verbiage that I want to use, I cannot stress enough that this guy wasn't even playing for this team at the start of this tournament. He was benched for almost the entirety of the summer split. Especially, he didn't play in the playoffs at all in the LPL. This is just an insane run for him right now to be able to get his signature champion on the world stage and to be able to punish a team like T1 in the way that he did in this game. You've just got to feel so good for him individually as a player because this was an exceptional performance from him. But again, you do want to give credit to the rest of the team for being able to facilitate it as well. You know, I was very critical of Knight on the Galio in game number 2, mostly because that comp felt like it lacked a lot of direction in terms of where it wanted to go. The Xin Zhao just didn't feel like the complementary piece to the Galio that you kind of needed in order to make it worth it to take Knight off of something that could actively carry in terms of the damage he was outputting. Well, if you're going to take, you know, Knight off of a primary damage dealer, a Silas or something like that, in a meta like this, you better give him something like, oh, I don't know, Shun's Kindred to be able to make it worthwhile, and it makes it so much more acceptable. It makes it so much more understanding of why they would want to move in that direction. And to his credit, Knight played his best Galio game. This is the best he has played this champion. I've never really loved his Galio. I don't think it's necessarily ever looked all that comfortable for him, but you wanted to see him sacrifice basically everything that he could sacrifice in order to make sure this Kindred was in a good spot. Here you go, flashing over the wall at level 1 or whatever, level 3 it was, to be able to catch out Owner and be able to pick up that first blood, be able to get Shun his mark basically for free, and, you know, really be able to snowball the game out of control from there. That's what Knight was very much willing to do in order to secure this game for the Kindred. It was really good stuff. Elk and Bin were exceptionally good as damage carries throughout this game. I think Bin has been punished a lot in terms of his early games. He's really been favoring Rumble so far in the finals, and Rumble, quite frankly, has looked excellent so far in the finals. You know, again, I saw a bunch of people in my comment section of my meta report video at the beginning of this tournament talking about how Rumble was just going to be out of the meta. Clearly, this champion can do a ton. Obviously, it is punished quite a bit by lane swaps, but it can survive at least a little bit, and it creates so much in the late game. The damage is so real, and you can't ignore it. There's no way to actually just shut off the Rumble. As long as he's at these fights, it's going to be a problem. A really nice bounce back game from Elk to be able to really properly prioritize a lot of the targets that were landed by On, who was a huge playmaker on the Blitzcrank. This is his best champion. I don't care what people say. I know the broadcast has gone on this big crusade that it's Rakan. It is Blitzcrank. When you are able to give him something like Blitz, he's just able to affect the game in a lot of ways that other players just aren't able to do. Exceptional stuff from Bilibili, and they are now one game away from being able to take the World Finals. For T1, their backs are up against the wall, but it's not a position they are unfamiliar with. This is a team that has faced adversity all year long, at least in terms of internal self-created adversity, but adversity nonetheless. They have been put in bad positions throughout the entirety of this year, and they've been able to make it out. And so, obviously, they've got to do that again, but it's certainly not looking all that good. Again, I like this draft here for T1. I think it gave them options. They just got outplayed, and whoever you want to give dud of the game to in that particular instance, I think is generally justified. I think the two players I was really considering for this were Owner and Faker. I think it has to be one of those two. I think both of them played a lot worse than their opposition on the other side of this matchup. I'm giving it to Faker. I think the Silas is a little bit stronger right now, but again, Owner, Faker, I would give them basically identical grades for this game. I think both of them ended up just not being even half as useful as their opposition on the other side. I think that's really going to be an issue for T1. Again, this isn't a bad draft. It's not even an uncomfortable draft. Silas has obviously proven to be strong so far in this series, and I would argue that Vi has just straight up been Owner's best champion over the course of 2024, but man, did it not really work out at all here in game number 3. We already talked about it a bit, but Owner just mega out-jungled. He was never in a position where he could ever pressure the Kindred, and if you're playing Vi and you find yourself in that position, it's kind of over. Like, you're really not going to be in a decent spot to be able to figure that out. Same thing for Faker. Again, Silas has been a champion that's kind of dominated the entirety of this bracket stage of Worlds and has really picked up in popularity without a lot of really clean answers. The Galio proved itself to be a really good one in this game because there was just no way for Silas to actually be able to do any damage. Galio obviously never dies. We saw that multiple times throughout this game where Knight was just basically entirely unkillable on the other side of this map, and Faker just was entirely ineffective because, again, no damage. And so, overall, Owner, Faker, whoever you want to give dud of the game to, I think is relatively fair. I also think Zeus and Keria are kind of in the, sphere for this. I think Keria had a significantly worse game in Game 3 than he did in Game 2. It's kind of been a bit of a roller coaster over the course of this series for him. He was, really great in Game 2, but Games 1 and 3 certainly not quite as dominant in this game, actually on a champion that he plays a ton of, that he played really well in that game number 2. Zeus also just not as effective on the Jax. If you're going to pick somebody's signature pick into them, you have to be able to pilot it as if you are just as good, and that just didn't happen here in game number 3. I think overall T1 just had a myriad of problems. Like, I'm not going to pinpoint one or two individual players as like the only issue here for T1. That was just not the case. They were outplayed basically across the board. This was just a straight up better game for Bilibili, and now they're up 2-1. Again, we already talked about it. They're one game away from winning Worlds, from their dream coming true, from BLG being the Chinese team that ends up finally conquering T1. Are they going to be able to close it out in game number 4, or are T1 going to be able to pick up yet another win here, push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, and hopefully finally bring us a game that is actually relatively close in this series? We will find out now, because the winner of game number 4 was T1. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up the series at 2 apiece, and in the World Finals this year, we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. I wouldn't have asked for it any other way. We've had some pretty slow games, to be entirely honest, to kick off this series. 1, 2, and 3 were all stomps in one way or another, but we finally got a really fun back and forth game where both teams really are putting in a lot of good work. I think BLG has a very cohesive draft here. Scaling has been incredibly strong at this tournament so far in drafting, Smolder plus Ziggs, especially with Smolder kind of being the go-to answer right now to the Sylas, I think is a really great idea. And honestly, just because it didn't work doesn't mean I think it's a bad decision for BLG to make, but T1 felt so much more comfortable when they had the Poppy in the jungle. We'll talk about why that wasn't, the only thing that ended up working well for them. There were obviously so many things going right for T1 in the back half of this game, but BLG still with the exceptionally good early games. They obliterated Zeus at the pre-level 3 margin. This Rumble, this game was over for him. There was no way he was ever going to be able to get back and be useful at any point in this game, purely from how BLG ended up playing the early game. Now, on the flip side, Bin was also pretty heavily taken out of the game. You were relying a ton on Elk, who got a ton of the gold here on the Ziggs to be able to really make the most of the kind of early lead and a lot of the aggressive plays that you ended up going for with the double dive down in the bot lane, but just didn't end up working out that way. Really couldn't ever get online in that same facet. Knight never really was able to completely take over on the Smolder, and the star of the game was on the other side of the map. There were 2 players in particular that I think were worth pointing out, but I mean, come on. Player of the game has to go to Faker in the mid lane. How could it possibly go to anybody else in this one in game 4? The Sylas was exceptionally good. As much as I love the Renata from Keria, and trust me, I think that there is a strong argument to be made that Keria is once again player of the game here in game number 4. The Renata has just been exceptionally good when he is, not in that game 3 comp, and, when BLG isn't just completely controlling the map the entire game. When Keria is actually allowed to play the game, he looks awesome, but, I mean, it has to be Faker. He's making game-winning play after game-winning play. He ends up solo killing the Ziggs on the top side of the map. That's a gigantic gold swing in favor of T1. I'm not going to say that single-handedly wins them the game or anything like that, but, that's one of those plays that just completely takes all of the momentum out of BLG's hands. It makes it very difficult for them to be able to play the map from that point on, because Ziggs can no longer actually survive on his own. A lot of that gold, like I said, went into Elk, went into the Ziggs, and it just didn't end up paying out. Faker was better in a lot of these instances. His positioning was amazing. His ability to utilize all of the ultimates on the other side of the map, absolutely perfect. The one fight that everyone's going to point out is just this, cacophony of ultimates coming out from T1. You have the stolen Rakan ultimate coming out from the Sylas to be able to capture everybody. He actually proto-belts his way into the rest of the team to be able to get the rest of the Rakan charm that immediately lands into the Rumble ultimate. You have the hostile takeover coming in from the Renata, and then finally a 3-man Poppy knockup with the ultimate, and that's just it's as perfect of a team fight as you are ever going to get in League of Legends, and it's facilitated and really created by Faker, by the star of the team, by the captain, by whatever you want to call him. He is the one that makes that happen, that creates that situation in the first place. So big credit to Faker, just an elite Sylas game. Obviously, this champion is looking incredibly good right now in the World Finals. We've seen the popularity rise and rise and rise as the tournament has gone along, and it's really kind of culminating here in the World Finals on the biggest possible stage. So really big ups to Faker. He was amazing here. But again, I don't want to undersell the rest of this team. I think Owner and Keria are, of course, the other 2 that really stand out. The Poppy is just incredibly strong into the draft that BLG ended up drafting. R5 Rakan makes sense because On's really good at it, and that's obviously obviously that, they just want to comfort for him. They wanted to put him on something that he's good at. But, I mean, Rakan was useless this game. There was absolutely nothing that he was ever going to be able to do into the Poppy. Owner in general is very, very good at this champion. LCK junglers in general have played so much Poppy. Like, that is the region where Poppy jungle exists by far the most. And so you have these circumstances where T1 is just going to be a lot more comfortable playing that matchup out, and Owner obviously executed it well. But Keria is an absolute menace. He is a true monster on this Renata. Like, this was an unbelievable game, and honestly, at least through the first 4 games, if T1 ends up winning this series, it really feels like Keria is on pace to be finals MVP, bar some sort of ridiculous game number 5 coming in from one of the players, because he's just been so consistent in their wins. He has been such an integral part of the aggressive plays that they've wanted to make, and even really surviving a lot of these bad early games that T1 has ended up having. BLG's early games have been better, basically across the board, with the exception, I would say, of game number 2, but even in this one, like, it's not like they were winning, they were just losing only a little bit, and they were able to get themselves back in because of some really good plays. I do also want to credit Zeus for just surviving in this game. It was kind of a disaster, and it's not even entirely his fault. Again, just getting double dove down in the bot lane on this lane swap is really not good. It's really easy to take out top laners in this current meta with just the way things have progressed, but obviously Zeus did a great job of being able to keep his cool about him and be able to, just go next and survive and be useful in a lot of these fights, still do a lot of damage. So big credit to T1. Another great game. Really nothing else to say, but keeping themselves alive, it was obviously necessary, but it's still game 5. Like, you still got to go out and win another. That's the hard part of being down 1-2 in a series like this. For BLG, you had an opportunity here. There was definitely a lot of circumstances that could have caused you to just straight up win this game and to end the World Championships as the champions, as world champions, but it didn't end up working out that way. Dud of the game is honestly kind of difficult. I think that there are a couple of options. On and Shun were definitely kind of in the brain, wave. I think Bin continues to just not look all that good on Gnar. I think you have to get him off of this champion. It clearly just doesn't seem like something that this team is going to be able to play around in the same kind of way as some of these more aggressive top laners, but I'm going to give it to Elk. I think he's the dud of the game for me, mostly because so much was on his shoulders in this game. They played so much Ziggs over the course of this year. This has been a pick that's really been prioritized by teams like BLG, and it really failed here. Like, I'm gonna be honest, none of the success in this game really came from the Ziggs. I think Elk was positioned really poorly. Obviously, dying to Faker in a solo kill on the top side is disastrous, and it completely destroys all the momentum in the game. But even outside of that, like, yes, the damage numbers are high, but so much of that damage is entirely wasted in terms of poke, and he's not really actually affecting teamfights nearly as much as you normally see out of that champion, especially because you're comboing it with something like Rakan and Sejuani. So much setup. You have a Smolder here for double damage. You can't even really focus on the Ziggs all that much, and yet the Ziggs is still not breaking the game wide open. It's really just not an ideal set of circumstances for a player in Elk who, historically has done really well in game 4s. We already saw it earlier in the quarterfinals where he had that game, or a career-defining performance. That statement performance against Hanwha Life really didn't happen here, and so definitely a bit disappointing, but like I said, Bin got obliterated in the top lane. You just have to get him off of the Gnar. It doesn't feel like it's a comfort pick at all for him, and he's just not making the same kinds of plays that Zeus is, even with more resources on his side. Shun, on, I just don't think they were all that relevant. I'm not going to blame Knight for this game. Smolder was, just a little bit over-eager. Like, they were just taking fights that they probably shouldn't have taken. They infinitely scale in this game if they play a little slower, just a little bit more passive, and I know I'm not usually the one to tell you to play more passive, but if you just, calm this down a little bit, I think you go into some of the back half of these fights maybe a little bit more prepared to actually win it if you can wait until 225 on Smolder, but alas, they don't end up taking game number 4, they don't end up capitalizing, and we go to a winner take all. It's the final game of the year, guaranteed. It's Silver Scrapes in game 5 of the World Finals. You couldn't ask for anything more. Both of these teams have really stepped up and really delivered here today, but only one is going to be able to walk out the world champion. It all comes down to this. Is it going to be T1? Is the dynasty going to continue? Or is Bilibili Gaming going to etch their names in League of Legends history? Well, the winner of game number 5 was T1. They are going to do it. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2. And for the second year in a row, your world champions are T1 once again. Faker reigns supreme, and let me tell you, Faker established his legacy once again here. This is not some sort of, oh, Zeus, Owner, Guma, and Keria played really well once again, and Faker was able to get another world title out of it. Faker won game number 5. He won game 4 with a lot of his aggressive plays, his fantastic engages. He won game number 5, more so than anyone could possibly ask for. I'm spoiling it now. Come on, man. Finals MVP is Faker. If anyone picks anything else, they are absolutely trolling. They are losing their minds. I get it. Keria was amazing in this series, and I really don't want to downplay how good he was. He is a huge reason why game 5 existed in the first place, but really, at the end of the day, holy shit. Like, what a performance from the GOAT. Like, the best player that has ever played this stupid video game that we all love has continued to prove time in and time out that he is untouchable, that the crown really isn't actually all that heavy. It's fit perfectly for Faker. It's genuinely insane. I really, really want to make this clear, though. I am so proud of Bilibili Gaming. What a fight, what a performance they put up in this series. Even games 4 and 5 that they ended up losing. There is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of for BLG in a series like this. They played their absolute hearts out. They proved that they are on the verge of being the best team in the world, and that it just wasn't quite enough to be able to take down the GOAT and the best group of 5 that has ever existed in the history of League of Legends. They gave it such a good effort, and I know there's going to be a lot of takes out there, but I want to make mine abundantly clear. I want to make it very, very obvious where I stand. BLG, all of the respect in the world. Knight, you could make a really strong argument Knight was the best player at Worlds. Like, when you talk about the tournament as a whole, Knight was unbelievable. And if I have to hear anybody in the offseason talk about how Knight couldn't get the job done, I'm going to absolutely throw someone out a window. I mean, truly, there is nothing left for someone like that to prove. He was the only one in this game with a chance of being able to win it, and he just got a little bit overeager in a chase down in the mid lane. If he ends up playing it a little bit slower, waiting for the bin teleport, perhaps we're looking at a completely different game. But outside of that, he won them a fight that could have potentially won them the world championship. There is nothing to be ashamed about. You have players in Bin and Shun and Elk and even On, who's going to get a lot of criticism for this game number 5, that all played well enough for them to be able to pick up a victory. It was barely not enough against the best team of all time. This is a team that I do not want to sell in any sort of negative way, but at the end of the day, it's T1, and it's the greatest group of 5 players that has ever played this video game. It's Zeus, it's Owner, it's Faker, it's Gumayusi, and it's Keria. There is no doubt, there is no debate anymore, in my opinion. I don't think that this is even any sort of controversial take. This is the greatest and most successful lineup of 5 players ever, and they have proven it once again. This is 3 straight World Finals, 2 World Finals victories for these 5 players. It's just unreal. You hear so much about the legends of the past, about what they were able to accomplish with miracle years. You even hear about SKT teams in the past. You hear about 2015 and how they're the best team that's ever played. You hear about 2016 and about how they're pretty close to being the best team that's ever played. Hell, you even hear about 2014 Samsung White, right? You hear about, 2018 Invictus Gaming. There's so many, names and rosters that are thrown out as potentially the greatest team of all time. But at the end of the day, it is no longer a debate. It is this iteration of T1, and it's led by the greatest player of all time, Finals MVP, Faker. I hope this means he finally gets his Galio skin. I really do think that that is kind of necessary after this game number 5. I mean, he solo won this. The amount of plays that he genuinely just completely turned in favor of T1 by himself, I could count on 3 hands. It is actually insane how important he was towards this victory. Not only did he completely turn around that fight that I was talking about, that BLG seemed to have decisively won in Near Dragon. They were able to pick off Gumayusi. They were able to start chasing T1 out. They just got a little bit overeager. Faker with the perfect turnaround to be able to catch out Knight. And all of a sudden, that fight is completely in favor of T1, and then obviously saving Zeus on the top side. No other mid laner there, I truly believe this, no other mid laner there ults in to save the Gragas. Every other mid laner, every other team makes the call. No, we're doing something else on the map. Zeus can die on the top side. There's 4 people there. Why would we go up and try to save him? Faker says, screw it. I win the 4v2. I can actively save this. I can salvage enough time to be able to get the rest of the team here, and he does that. The rest of the team gets there, and they're able to win it because this Gallia was unkillable. It is unbelievable. Like, this is GOAT status for Faker. There's nothing else left to say. Like, this is the last 2 games, game 4, game 5. They're the 2 best games that Faker has played maybe ever. I really do think that they're going to be in that conversation. When I think about Faker's defining plays of his entire career, when I think about somebody who's been around that long, like, these are 2 games that are going to stay in my memory. These are 2 games that are going to establish, like, what I think of when I think of, like, why Faker is the GOAT, and he absolutely deserves that. There's nothing else even really left to say. I mean, what can I say that everybody else hasn't? This guy has done everything. I mean, it's Faker. Like, I'm underselling him by saying the things that I'm saying, but you know, it is what it is, but I don't want to take anything away from the rest of this team either. Owner played maybe his best game of the series here in game number 5 on the Xin Zhao. This is a hard game to play. I don't think Xin is a particularly good champion. I was very critical of this when they took it on R5, but you know, Owner knows best, and obviously it ends up working out. Keria was unreal. They don't win this series without Keria on the Renata in games 2 and 4. I firmly believe that. Gumayushi had so much gold, the gigantic lead that he was able to generate in such a pivotal game 5. The dude has absolute nerves of steel in these major moments, and he continued to prove it. And I once again want to reiterate, they're not at the World Championship. They don't, like, Faker doesn't get the chance to be able to pop off in game 4 and game 5 without Gumayushi playing the way that he did for 90% of this year. Guma is a massive reason why this trophy is coming home to T1 at all. And then Zeus, I mean, the weak side king in this series, he just plays this so well. I think people are going to forget that, you know, Zeus was definitely not very good for most of this year, but what does it even matter? I mean, dude, like, he shows up in the World Finals. If there's ever a place to show up, that's the place to show up. And for a guy who was talked about all the time, like just 3 years ago, as somebody that they were worried about not being a big game player, somebody who was not looking good in LCK finals, who was, you know, getting abused by players like Doran in big moments, like, for him to now be not only a finals MVP last year, but somebody who stepped up and played weak side and absorbed so much pressure to still stay, like, relevant in these games and win them a world championship in 2024. It's ridiculous how much the narrative has shifted and changed on Zeus. It's just, I mean, there's nothing else left to say about this group of T1, and honestly, this is where I kind of disagree, I think, with a lot of the sentiment. I hear a lot of people talking, and T1 fans might yell at me for this in the comments, but I'm actually curious if you guys agree or disagree. I see so many T1 fans saying, like, or so many people just in the community saying that T1 has to stay together, they have to prove that they can try to three-peat. There's nothing left for this group of 5 to establish. If they win next year, to me, like, there's nothing to prove. Like, they are the best group of 5 of all time. There's no more legacy to establish. They have established every bit of their legacy. I'm interested to see what happens with T1 moving forward. If they're able to bring back all 5, that's fantastic. You know, obviously, I assume all 5 are going to be playing next year. I assume players like Faker aren't retiring. I imagine we would have gotten that news at some point by now, but you know, I don't know what else there is for this group. I don't think you ever reach this high. Like, I think this is the climax of the T1 story. It's going to be interesting to see where they go from here. Again, let me know if you think I'm a psychopath for saying that down in the comments. Maybe a three-peat to you is something that does end up mattering, but like, this is just, like, they have proven everything. There is nothing left for this group of 5 players to show. They have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are the best to ever do it. And then for Bilibili on the other side, I've already kind of gone into it, but, like, again, absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. You have players like Elk and On that were discarded and thrown away by LPL fans. You had Elk lounging and just floundering away on Ultra Prime down in 17th place, you know, just a couple of years ago. You had On, who was getting criticism for starting over Sword Art on, you know, Suning and Weibo back in the day, and, you know, even getting criticism when he was playing with Huanfeng and, you know, actually doing relatively well on that Weibo team before getting signed to BLG in 2022. You had these 2 players that had not really shown that they could be world caliber players. You put them together on this team, you know, they both are able to emerge and become some of the best players in the world, full stop, regardless of position. I think Elk has proven that he is a borderline top 5 player in the world. You have a player in Shun who I've said a million times, he got benched, he didn't play the most of the summer split, and yet here he is going to game 5 in the world finals, pushing T1 to the absolute brink. It's ridiculously good. You have someone like Knight, who I've already mentioned was maybe the single best player at this entire tournament from a whole perspective. You know, it's actually crazy how well he was able to play, and I hope he gets the credit he deserves for the crazy run. And I can't imagine how heartbreaking this is for someone like Bin to lose twice in the World Finals, to be somebody that, you know, got his signature champion and honestly wasn't really able to make it count in this game number 5. It's got to be heartbreaking, but I mean, this is such a positive for BLG. They absolutely took T1 to the limit. They took them to the brink, and they were moments away multiple times in both Game 4 and Game 5 from hoisting that trophy. It just wasn't meant to be this year. I'm hoping that, you know, they stay together. This is the core that I really do think can absolutely start to challenge for being the best team of all time if they are able to stick, but it just wasn't their year. It's T1's year. It's Faker's year once again, and the GOAT reigns supreme. All right, but that is going to do it. Not only for World Finals, not only for Worlds here in 2024, but for everything here in 2024. I honestly can't tell you guys how much it means to me that you've been along for the ride with me for this, whether you found me through, you know, the World's content, whether you found me through any of the regional content, hell, whether this is the first video that you've seen of mine. I really do appreciate it. We put in a ridiculous amount of hours. I'm sure someone can look at it. I have a playlist full of every single video that we've made over the course of this year. I think I've put out like 700 or 800 hours worth of content over the course of this year. It's got to be more than almost any other, you know, non-infinite streamer channel. Like, it's insane what we've been able to do over the course of this year. That's the passion that we have here for making these videos, for talking about these games, and I know you guys have that passion as well because you've been here, and I just want to say thank you. This is kind of the big culmination over the course of this year. As much as it's a, you know, coronation for T1, like, this is everything that, you know, I've worked for over the course of this year, and it's really cool to see it all wrapped up in what is such an interesting conclusion. I hope it was as interesting for you guys as it was for me, but again, I can't say thank you enough. Like, this is a passion project for me. You know, I usually don't go into depth on these kinds of things, but you guys probably know I don't make a ton of money. I don't make any money really off of these videos, and so you know, to be able to get that feedback from the community, it really means a lot. You guys have been so kind and so communicative in the comment sections of all of these videos, and it really means a ton. Like, whether you agree or disagree with my takes, it's always been fun being able to chat it out with you guys. It's not over. I am going to be taking at least a little bit of a break. Again, we've basically nonstop been watching and covering League of Legends for 11 months on this channel, and so I'm probably going to take at least a week to just chill out, you know, try to decomp and, you know, get back into the swing of things, but we are going to be doing off-season content. I don't want to make any promises in terms of like dates for any of that, because we're going to be working towards that whenever you know, we get a ton of news. Whenever all the rosters are released, that's when I'll start to, you know, crank some of the videos out. But we've already gotten a ton of roster news on the LEC and the LCS. Those videos are of course going to be coming out, and, you know, with everything, I shouldn't call it the LCS, the LTA now, you know, changing into next year. So there's so much going on moving into 2025. We'll talk about it all in the off season, but again, just a heartfelt thank you for everybody. Let me know what your favorite moment of the year was down in the comment section below, whether or not that's a Worlds moment, whether it's just some random game in the middle of the region, whether it's, you know, a player maybe emerging, or just a storyline that you really liked. What is the thing that you are going to think about, or that gave you the most amount of joy in 2024 from League of Legends esports? I would love to know your thoughts on all of that down in the comments. I'm just so curious to hear from you guys, and, you know, again, it's been great. So thank you all, but with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all